Welcome to the Cinematologists podcast. I'm Neil Fox, and joining me as ever is Dario Linares. Hello, Dario. How are you doing?
Hello, Neil. I'm doing very well. Nice to record once again on a Friday. It's been interesting, sort of this week, coming out of a really heavy week of doing teaching and then doing some like a research presentation, which I haven't done for a while, and kind of weirdly nervous, and then imposter syndrome-y in process of doing that, but really looking forward to this chat today, actually, because I think some of the talking points and some of the strands of interest around students and students in film education is something I'm coming back into from a different angle now, being just solely a teacher at the moment. So, and in some ways, the student-teacher relationship and the baggage that tutors bring to their teaching is such an interesting subject, and has kind of made me think in various new ways about that.
Fab. Yeah. And that is something that I think we'll hear a bit about throughout this episode in terms of a student experience, which is kind of where sort of the central focus of the episode is completely entwined with a staff experience. And, that is a relationship that is, it's an interrelationship. One can't really be experienced without the other, and how they're connected in interesting ways is what we're going to chat about. So yeah, this is an episode, we'll call it Students on Screen, because that is the project that it's kind of contributing towards, and sort of reflecting upon. And you will hear shortly from the founders of the Students on Screen project, Dr. Bethan Michael Fox and Dr. Kay Calver, who have sort of been working in this space for a number of years, looking at representations of students on screen across sort of non-fiction and narrative work. And they've put together a special issue looking at different representations of students on screen, and for the journal Open Screens, which at the time that you're listening to this will be out, because this episode is sort of part of that issue in and of itself. It's not just a kind of addendum, it is sort of a part of that. And which always makes these recordings kind of temporally weird. When we know it's going to be months. So as I'm saying this, I know it's going to be months until you actually hear it. So maybe Dario's opinion on his week of going back into teaching will be vastly different in 6 months. Who knows?
Yeah. It's a funny one, that when you're trying to stitch something together that's more a collection of audio pieces, you get into that weird mindset. Although I think at the back end, actually, it doesn't really affect the listening experience that much. It's just that something that might be recorded in January and you end up kind of stitching it together in July. In your mind, things have changed or things have shifted and things have moved. But yeah, this is something that's sort of been in the pipeline for a while, hasn't it, Neil? And I know that essentially we were going to write something together, but it ended up just being you writing, because I welched on it and was like, no, I'm too busy for this, as we've both done with each other at various points.
Absolutely.
But I think it's an interesting subject, and your paper, which is entitled "Being Nick von Sternberg," who we'll come to that reference in a second. So, "Being Nick von Sternberg: Critical Parodies of Film Students in Anglophone Cinema," was something we were kind of talking about in relationship to not just the representations of students themselves, but how the way that they are represented kind of fits in with narratives or discourses of film education versus film industry. So that's layered on top of the kind of stereotypes of students generally, I think. But then also within that, there's sub divisions of antagonisms, of contradictions, let's say, in the way that film is taught, and even what film is supposed to be. I think, particularly, I think from my perspective, that history of the relationship between theory and practice, which is then on top of that is built on top of that sort of foundation of the clash, is the clash between practitioner and theorist as teacher, and practitioner as teacher. So there's kind of a lot of layerings of discourse on top of the idea of, how film students are portrayed in movies. But I think as well, it's quite difficult. It's a difficult paper to write, or I can see that the challenges that you've had in writing it, also in terms of the different national contexts. So you talk about anglophone cinema, but still the US and the UK are very different. And then you get into France, or you get into world cinema. Again, horrible term, but wherever it is you might be talking about, has very specific ways of thinking, I think, about that relationship between student and teacher, and practitioner and theorist.
Yeah, nicely put together, because there are all those layers at play, and it's interesting that kind of students, I think, across a lot of representations, particularly narrative ones, almost become a kind of battleground for those ideologies. Which is why I think Beth and Kay's work is interesting in terms of just paying special attention to that aspect of it as a way through to the other stuff, rather than sort of starting within those sort of positions. And that's definitely something that sort of we mentioned in a chat, which you'll hear shortly. But what you mentioned there as well is also kind of part of the difficulties of kind of looking at it in any kind of context which tries to be representative, but is also aware of other contexts. And I think that like particularly French cinema has a very different approach to its representations of film students, and then there's kind of Scandinavian representations, and a lot of those are tied to the national context of how the industry operates and how film culture is seen in those places, which I would like to look at some point. And also it's nice because it comes out of a period of so the paper that we're going to talk about was something that I looked at initially in my doctorate, which I sort of graduated from about 10 years ago. But then a lot of the examples were films that we talked about in the last few years from working within education and sort of seeing these films which represented film students in quite different ways. So it's nice to be able to kind of go back and revisit for that. So grateful for Kay and Beth to sort of invite us and then sort of support me to do that. And we make it explicit in this conversation, but there is a conflict of interest in terms of Beth is my partner and co-parent. So she's very good at letting people know that was handled very professionally throughout the process. But again, it's nice because as we sort of talk about in that conversation, these conversations about students and academic life are a part of our daily life as academics who teach. So it's been a nice project to be involved in terms of thinking about it in a variety of different ways. And very, very grateful to them for their time, both to sort of put this special issue together and also to come on the podcast and have a conversation about the Students on Screen project more broadly.
Yeah, always nice, I think, to have these episodes that are related, I think, to academic outputs in that sense. Always gives us an opportunity to sort of resituate the podcast within those contexts, which I know is helpful. Obviously, for this bit, is helpful to you, but also, again, I think is helpful more generally in that idea of this being just more than a couple of guys chatting about film, which we always try to make it more than that on every episode. But it's good to place it within that framework. And hopefully even more might come out of this, because I think that this subject is ripe for a video essay for sure.
Yeah, which I'm excited to see the fruits of that as we move on. But let's get into it now. So what you're going to hear here is a conversation between sort of Beth and Kay and myself about the Students on Screen project and the focus of the special issue, and then a short reflection from me on that special issue, including the voices of some of the contributors to some of the papers that are featured in it. And then we'll be back after that to talk about the piece that I've written, but also a kind of a particular representation of film students and film education that is not in the paper. So We'll be back soon, but for now, this is myself with Dr. Bethan Michael Fox and Dr. Kay Calver. Welcome to Cinematologists podcast. This is a lovely treat to have the two of you on the podcast talking about Students on Screen project, but also a lovely treat to have you, Beth. Even though it's very, very weird to be interviewing you. I hope it's not too weird for you and for listeners who know that we are partnered.
Yes, I mean, everything about you is weird, Neil. That's, of course, why I've chosen to spend such a large proportion of my life with you. And I like being on the podcast, having heard so many recordings over the years, brought you cups of coffee as you chat away to Dario, listening to the booming of two men's voices upstairs as I'm, pottering away elsewhere. So, yeah, thank you for having us. It's a great privilege to be here on the Cinematologists. I'm desperate to say the tagline whenever I say it. The Cinematologists. Isn't it called? Mark what?
Mark Commode.
Mark Commode's favourite podcast. Don't you know? Don't you know it's Mark Commode's favourite podcast?
We don't bank on that anymore. We don't trade on that.
No. You're in the top 10 film podcasts on Apple. I know all your stats.
All the stats, as you should. But yeah, this is a really nice treat to be talking to you both, particularly about this project, which obviously, because I've known you both for a long time, I've been there sort of seeing it sort of grow from the start. So do you want to just talk us through what the Students on Screen project is and how it came into being, please?
Yeah, of course. So in my academic role, my name is Beth, Dr. Bethan Michael Fox. I work at the Open University now. When I started teaching in higher education, it was at the University of Bedfordshire in the Bedford campus. And I met Kay, Dr. Kay Calver, at a BERA conference, which is the British Educational Research Association. Was it Manchester?
Yeah, it was in Manchester. Yeah, that's where we first met, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I watched Kay give a brilliant presentation on teenage pregnancy, which was her doctoral research, and asked a question, and we got chatting afterwards. And she mentioned that she was moving to near the area, and we kept in touch. And she ended up getting a job at the University of Bedfordshire as well, which was a great treat and absolutely brilliant to be able to then work together. And during our time working together on a couple of degrees in the School of Education and English Language there, we had a company come in to produce a documentary called Freshers, which was about students. And it was like a reality TV style doc where they'd follow freshers around for their first week at uni, following the stories of individual students. So we had these cameras on campus all the time. And we had this sort of strange week of thinking, do we avoid them? Do we dress differently? What do we do? And we were sort of running around corners to get away from these cameras following everyone. But over time, we noticed at open days that students were mentioning the TV show. They were saying, oh yeah, because we saw Forrest on this TV show, and made us think I too could go to university because, I'm like him, or vice versa. Or sometimes students saying, well, I watched it and like everyone was really young. Is it going to be like that? So that raised for us a lot of questions around how much do representations of students on screen actually impact the lived experience of students who are going to university. And then we started generating some research and outputs from there, didn't we, Kay?
Yeah, so we saw a call for papers from Rachel Brooks and Sarah O'Shea, who were doing an edited book collection around reimagining the higher education student. And we saw this call and we thought, actually, this is a really great way to kind of start to kind of consolidate and kind of explore some of our kind of thoughts around that documentary Freshers. And we'd had lots of conversations about that. And so we thought it was a great opportunity to kind of launch this project of Students on Screen. So we replied to that kind of call for papers, and that's where our first publication came from, where we were looking at constructing the university student in British documentary television. So we looked at the documentary that Beth mentioned around Freshers, but we also identified other documentaries to look at the kind of themes that might cut across. And at this point, Beth wasn't working at Bedford anymore and had relocated down to beautiful Cornwall. And so it was a great opportunity for us to kind of work together across geographical differences. And we really enjoyed producing the paper, watching the documentaries, having these kind of critical conversations about what this might suggest about the lives and experiences of university students today, but also how it might shape and influence people's perceptions of students and some of those kind of key representations of students, and how it might open up possibilities and thinking about who students are as part of the widening participation agenda, but also how it might create perhaps very stereotypical views of students, and perhaps raise anxieties and concerns about the state of university and the idea that some students might be there not for academic purposes. And I think that was one of the key findings really from that first paper, that students were often positioned not as academics, not interested in the academic study, but there to party, to have fun, and actually having quite negative experiences of reading, for example. And that was often kind of depicted as kind of it there to kind of socialize rather than proceed with their studies. Yeah, go on, Beth.
There was a great quote, wasn't there, from Summer, where she goes, I could probably do this. I could probably read a book.
And so it was a really interesting one because Freshers was filmed while we were there, even my mum was like, oh, I've been watching the documentary and, our students really like that today. And it was really interesting, as Beth said, to see, yes, they've produced this documentary about students, but to what extent is it representative of students' lives, and how might it shape and influence broader kind of societal views and perceptions? And so that was a really interesting kind of book chapter that we explored. And I suppose it kind of perhaps focused more upon what might be the more stereotypical, fun, carefree perception of students. And I think as the project evolved, we noticed a real shift in representations of students from this kind of fun, fun-free student having the best time of their lives, going out and drinking and partying, and to representations of students as being incredibly stressed and at risk. And we thought that was quite an interesting shift as part of the construction of students. And so our kind of papers that kind of built on that initial documentary analysis look more at the perceptions of risk of students. So, for example, we have a journal article around under pressure representations of student suicide in higher education. And we noticed there was a wide range of documentaries looking at experiences of student suicide in university settings, and how the university itself was kind of positioned as being a risky place for students, and perhaps being an unsupportive institution for students. And so it's quite interesting to see how there was this quite dramatic shift in representations of students on screen, from this kind of fun, happy environment to quite a dark side of university. And I suppose that's what probably captures our more recent publications, doesn't it, Beth? This idea about dark universities and the risks that they might pose to students.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really it. Yeah, universities as a place that are not seen as kind of a safe space or a space for kind of life development. It's very much about a very kind of sort of programmatic career, and sort of the pressures of entering that space following sort of particularly British education is it's been interesting to see those kinds of representations emerge, because we all work in those environments as well.
Yeah, it's built a lot on the stuff on our bookshelves around the experience of working in HE, where we've got loads of books by researchers from the UK, Australia, US, who are writing about the idea of the death of higher education, of institutions, the neoliberal university, the zombie university, all those kinds of concepts, that universities have shifted from somewhere where students might be considered, for example, a risk for their radical political views, to a situation where students are more likely to be considered at risk from a predatory institution that's seeking to profit from them financially. and also for staff on temporary contracts, for staff who are put in really vulnerable positions by institutions that perhaps don't care for them in those sort of more supportive ways.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of it in that sense of how those documentaries that you write about and how your work itself sort of creates that sort of picture of student experience, which is actually more closely aligned to staff experience in terms of some of the literature that you were mentioning there, in ways that the general perception is that, you know, the student experience and the staff experience are wildly different in terms of the kinds of experiences and the kind of environment that it's that the university is for those two different groups.
I think that's an interesting element of the kind of documentaries, is kind of looking at some of those kind of wider institutional changes. So, for example, in the UK, shifts to student fees, and the idea now as kind of students as consumers, and trying to unpick some of those kind of broader kind of changes and trends in higher education policy. But also just to kind of flag that while some of our publications have looked at documentaries, so they've kind of tried to take perhaps more of a kind of educational stance in terms of trying to highlight key issues around the student experience and raise kind of public consciousness kind of around some of these key issues around students' experiences. Some of our other kind of publications have looked more at comedies. So not just kind of factual documentary analysis, but also looking at comedy. So Beth introduced me to The History Man and Their Very Peculiar Practice, which I hadn't seen before. And so they were really fun to sit down and watch. And then we looked at those in conjunction with Campus, which is much more recent comedy take. And so, yeah, I suppose our work kind of cuts across that kind of documentary analysis, but also looking at comedies and dramas.
Well, that's a lovely spread of sort of genres and forms and representations in your own work. And do you want to sort of just talk about where your work is now? Because obviously you've kind of gone from sort of your first contribution being to an edited collection to now sort of overseeing a special issue yourselves as editors. So do you want to talk about that project and what else you're kind of working on at the moment?
So the project really started in 2021. Which is when our first publication came out in the edited book by Rachel Brooks and Sarah O'Shea. And then in the last 4 years, we've had the 3 publications. And so that's been really great to kind of work together with Beth and to, you know, have a real love and interest of watching TV and, you know, being able to engage in critical discussions around that been great. And then we came up with a kind of proposal to do the journal special issue with, and we identified open screens as a relevant journal. And so what we wanted to do was kind of build upon what we were working on and open that out to kind of an international focus. So the edited collection, Beth, how many articles are there? I mean, it's a big project, Neil. It's a big project. I think it's about 14. Beth's going to look it up. So we went out for this call for papers to really kind of celebrate the range and breadth of TV, films, documentaries, but also kind of broadening it out to kind of perceptions and constructions of students on screen more broadly around kind of like social media constructions as well. And so it's a really interesting, well, obviously we think it's interesting because we're working on it, but it's a really interesting special issue that looks at that wide range of representations of students on screen across different age ranges. And so while mine and Beth's work is focusing on university students, the collection looks at that more broadly. So kind of looking at students in school as well as university environments as well. And it also kind of draws upon different international context as well. So whilst mine and Beth's work is primarily located within a UK context, the special issue kind of draws upon different countries. So we've got representations of kind of American TV, but also going across to India. Where else have we got kind of captured there?
Yeah, and we have an excellent submission from my young son Sung on the South Korean TV series Thread of Lies which is about academic success, teenage bullying and class tensions in that context. We've got coverage of The Chair. I mean, many people in academia will have watched The Chair. So we've got a paper about that from Mark Redman. We've got some really interesting stuff as well around like social media representations. So Zoe Hope Buletis has written about navigating dark academia and ideas about nostalgia and student identity in TikTok and social media representation. So we've kind of tried to go for a good breadth in terms of the sort of stuff that we're covering. Yeah, Devaleena's work on Kota Factory and the idea of shadow education in India is, I think, also a super interesting one that you'd mentioned already. But they're all great, aren't they? They're all great.
It's been a really lovely opportunity to kind of collaborate with other colleagues from around the world and see a range of different theoretical perspectives as well, kind of drawn upon in order to kind of analyse representations of students in spring. And that kind of cut across a range of different disciplines as well. And so I think that's a real kind of strength of the collection in the sense that lots of people from various kind of backgrounds and theoretical perspectives, and it brings a real kind of range of views and perspectives in terms of that analysis.
Yeah, and we were super lucky, weren't we, to actually be able to get a foreword from Rachel Brooks, Professor Rachel Brooks, who was the editor of the initial edited collection that we started this project through. So that's been a really nice kind of coming around.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then I suppose as part of the work that we've kind of been producing as part of the Students on Screen project, we recognise that one of the arguably one of the limitations of that work is that we're analysing these representations of students from our own kind of academic staff perspectives. And so we have managed to secure some funding to involve students in a kind of constructed analysis of these TV shows. And so we were successful in a Research England funding bid in order to recruit some research assistants. So we're currently kind of midway through that project at the moment. So we've recruited 3 research assistants from a variety of different disciplines as well. So we've got Verna, who is education, Fatima, who's English, and Bethan, who is from film and TV. So it's really lovely to work with students and to kind of discuss our watching of these shows from a range of different kind of views and perspectives. And it's really helping us to kind of see our analysis from different angles. And so that's been really useful. And so the funding is supporting the payment of the research assistants and also the attendance at conference. So we will be presenting our findings from the project later this year. And so the TV shows that we're kind of focusing on as part of this project is Clique, Normal People, and Big Boys. So we've taken 3 dramas this time. And one of the kind of the key themes that cut across this is kind of representations of risk for students, but also something that kind of connects them together. In addition to that is students' mental health. And so quite key and pertinent issues, both in kind of the public consciousness, but also in terms of kind of policy discussions at the moment around some of the stresses and pressures of students and to what extent universities are supportive institutions for students. So that's a really interesting funded project. And then we're kind of looking and scoping out for other opportunities to perhaps expand that onto a larger scale.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm sure that it will, because I think one of the things that the collection shows is that there's a real interest in this area, and I think a lot of it steps back to what we were talking about before in terms of working in this space and kind of it seems it's an interesting way for academics to better understand their own roles and their own lives and their students, I think, in a variety of different ways, which is really, really fascinating. And I'm looking forward to hearing more of those findings at the British Popular Culture Conference, which I'm organising down here with a colleague that you'll be presenting at in June.
Yeah, we should just add from an ethical point of view that we did carefully manage the fact that we live together and have kids together and are married in this whole process. Kay took charge of Neil and Dario's paper and managed the peer review for that. And we were mindful going into it. I think it's important to kind of reflect on those things, because when so many people are working academia, we do know each other. There's all sorts of things to reflect on and think about in terms of how we manage that. I realise a lot of the film people listening to this are probably like, why does it even matter? Maybe they're not, but yeah, we've got to think that stuff through, haven't we?
Yeah, it's well pointed out that it was very, very well managed. Very,
Oh, rigorous, absolutely brutal peer review of Neil's paper. No.
It benefited greatly from that professional approach, I think. So the one thing that I wanted to do with this episode is to kind of provide a bit of space for contributors to think about what's next in terms of representation. You talked in terms of like where the project might go, but obviously you spend a lot of time with a lot of representations of students, both in kind of factual and narrative, and like you say, social media sort of screen spaces. Where do you think that there are kind of key issues that could be explored in terms of those representations of students' lives in terms of screen media moving forward? Is there a sort of particular theme or area that you think is something that is not currently represented in a way that it should be, or that really needs to be sort of looked at?
I'd like to explore a bit more gender and sexual diversity around gender identity, sexual preferences, sexual identity in representations of students. But I think many representations of students are quite broad in most ways, with the exception of age and disability. I would say those are the two areas where mature students are often not so represented. We've got consideration of anxiety and people living with mental health conditions. So there's some sort of movement into that. Of course, we have the classic representations of mature students, and they're considered here in terms of educating Rita. But more recently, there doesn't seem to be so much representation. I think part of the issue with this is that often now you might have a situation where being a student is merely a part of the complex identity of someone's life. It's one facet of it, right? Like they're a student, but they're also a parent, and they're also working, and they're also, employed in some kind of financial, like there's so many parts of someone's identity that being a student isn't necessarily the primary one. And how do you represent that? So finding some, and then when you watch a series or a film or some content or anything, how are you saying that that's inherently about students if that's only one part of their identity? So I think as we have a situation where being a student is more likely to be one facet rather than necessarily the thing, it's a bit trickier to then pick apart, because we just lead such complicated and busy lives with so many dynamics. I mean, partly because I work at the Open University and have experience of many students who are in more complex settings, which makes also the point that I've not seen much about representations of students in secure environments. I don't think that's necessarily. I watch a lot of prison films and prison TV, and I'm not sure I've ever seen an example where someone's studying, but hit me up if you can think of one.
Well, we were talking about the Shawshank Redemption, weren't we? And but then the study in that is, essentially to aid an escape. It's not study for the sake of personal development. But it is an interesting
form of
point.
personal development, I suppose.
Yeah, a very good form of personal development in the long run. No, that's an interesting point. Actually, I think that's a nice one. And yeah, elsewhere in this episode, I talk about a film that I don't mention in my paper on representation of film students, which I watched recently for this recording, and it does have a representation of a mature film student, but again, it's part of her life where you also see her raising two kids on her own, working multiple jobs, and it is a facet of that. And also, it was interesting in this TV show, Dear White People, how the identity of her as a film student, the sort of the lead character in that, Sam, is one part of her personality. That she's also doing all of this other stuff, both kind of studying, but also, yeah, like it is a one facet. So that's a really interesting sort of note.
There was one film I really wanted to paper on, and I kept mentioning it in the calls for papers. I was so excited, but no one wanted to. Raw, the French movie where the vet students are cannibals. Like, how can we not have a paper on that? Devastated.
Well, that might be a follow-up, because I do have I only did anglophone in the end, because there's loads of interesting French students. I think would be a really interesting representation of French students, particularly film students, but certainly raw would be a great paper. That says a lot about being a student and an academic, I think, currently.
What about you, Kay? What's missing?
I was just thinking about you, when you were two talking, but I think as well, there's often the focus on students while they're kind of studying, but I think there's also a lack of representation of the transition after university. And I suppose that relates to kind of my ideas and interests around that transition to largely employment after university, and some of the kind of challenges that students experience as part of that, and the very kind of precarious job market that we kind of typically live within now. And I was trying to think while you were talking, can I think of a film or a TV show that really kind of explores that transition post university and the kind of complexities of experiences and feelings as part of that? And there's such a focus as part of, especially kind of UK university policy, kind of, but more broadly around the world, about university preparing students for employment, and to what extent is that successfully achieved. And a lot of these kind of representations of students on screen, it ends at the end of their studies, but arguably that's just one chapter of their experience. And kind of looking at some of those nuances of student transitions, but also the real inequalities in experience in terms of who's employed and what kind of positions they get based on a range of kind of demographic factors as well. And looking at inequalities within society, I think would be really interesting to represent on screen and to then kind of unpick and analyze.
Yeah, because you carry being a student into that space, don't you? And you're seen in as a graduate, but also the only film I can think of is Lena Dunham's Tiny Furniture. So Lena Dunham, who went on to do Girls, and in Tiny Furniture she plays a kind of film graduate, but she's in a position of privilege in the film. Obviously, she can sort of go and sort of float around, but there is an interesting aspect to it, which is how she's perceived in terms of what she studied, and why it wasn't more useful. And this idea of like, it has to be, people who are not in university, or that haven't gone through the university system, how they perceive it and how they perceive students and what they choose to study. So she has to deal with a lot of that.
I think that's something we've not currently got captured in the journal special issue, and that could perhaps be a kind of project to kind of build on next, is about that kind of analysis and construction of students post-study, and kind of to what extent was that degree actually meaningful and worthwhile, and how might that be kind of viewed and perceived by employers, and to what extent they actually felt ready for employment, or if we've got depictions of students and kind of experiencing long periods of unemployment, or ending up taking very low paid roles as part of that. And I suppose that can be seen to kind of position a kind of critique of the university system, and to what extent it might be seen to be fit for purpose, with this very strong emphasis on it being a form of preparing for employment. And that in itself can be really heavily criticised in terms of what is education for. And that's a kind of a bigger conversation and debate, isn't it? But definitely from a political perspective, the idea of university and how it's often pitched is that it will increase your employment prospects and your earning potential, and so looking at to what extent that might be achieved and how that's constructed in the media would be interesting.
If we do that, Kay, I'm going to write about How to Get Away with Murder, one of the greatest TV shows about students of all time. And I'm really interested also in the representations of academics, and she's got to be my favourite academic on screen. She's absolutely brilliant. Professor Annalise Keating in How to Get Away with Murder. But that's a good one, I think, because those students are doing the ultimate employability, aren't they? They're solving cases and doing things as they actually complete their degrees, but they leave university in such an absolutely traumatized mess that there's no way that they'll ever be able to get gainful employment.
And I think that's an interesting point that you mentioned, that while our project is called Students on Screen, an inevitable part of that is the representation of staff. And so that kind of interrelated experience, that, you know, students will encounter staff, and that their relationship is entwined. And so some of our analysis has kind of looked at how members of staff are kind of represented in the institution, and how they're often seen to be involved in problematic practices. But I think that could definitely be an area that could be built upon in terms of representations of staff. Campus was quite interesting in the sense of the Campus TV show, if you've not come across it, looks a lot at both kind of academics, but also senior leadership teams, but also had quite a large focus on staff that worked in administration teams as well, which is quite an underrepresented area of the university, and perhaps something that isn't often captured. And so I think that's quite an interesting perspective from an analysis perspective.
Yeah, Campus was by the people that made Green Wing, but more people probably be familiar with Green Wing, sort of weird dystopian comedy. It was pretty bad, to be honest. Sorry, folks. It wasn't great.
Although weirdly, the I was trying to figure out. I was watching something. In Wicked, I was trying to think about where does the father of the main character in Wicked. I was like, where do I recognize that guy from? And it's the is it the VC or the main horrible sleazy character in Campus, the actor who's so funny. He's in Wicked, which is interesting.
I think I enjoyed it the first time I watched it, and then when you rewatch it from a kind of critical standpoint, it gets more and more problematic.
Yeah.
But it's got some of my favourite ever anecdotes, where there's the guy who's an English lecturer is sat with his doctoral student who's there on some kind of sports scholarship and clearly isn't particularly interested in literature, and they're trying to mark essays, so they just pick an essay up, grab a dart, throw it at the dartboard, and give it whatever score it lands on. And this poor doctoral student has read it really thoroughly and wants to like talk about it, and he's like, nope, it's a 2-1.
The real insight into academia. Well, I will, I understand what it takes to put together any kind of edited collection, so I won't say that all of that sounds like a great idea for another one. But I do thank you for your work on this collection and across the years. I think it's a really interesting body of work. And thank you for chatting to me today.
Thanks very much, Neil.
You're welcome, Dr. Fox, Prof. Fox.
Alongside talking to Kay and Beth, I wanted to get a sense of the feelings around representation from some of the contributors to the special issue, particularly regarding that question I asked Beth and Kay at the end about where do they feel like some of the gaps might be in terms of representation that need to be addressed by screen media moving forward. I talked to 3 contributors, and you'll hear those very, very brief conversations now. First up, I talked to Dr Sharon Coleclough from the University of Staffordshire about her piece, The Pleasure of Prohibited Spaces, Playing School Student Characters in Video Games.
What is the key argument in your piece?
So, because I'm looking at students in the game world, there's a few different things going on within it. So the first is that the student character kind of promotes this key options in terms of narrative and the actions that you can undertake because it's an immersive media, so you have some power. I've made a section called Loving and Fighting, and the G's are not there, and that's very important. And essentially, that's just a really useful summation of the way that we use younger characters within games, where we have these narrative options. And loving and fighting doesn't necessarily mean just falling in love and fighting with people, but that idea of fighting for friendship, loving your friends, loving your family. Those are sort of key kind of concepts within the piece. Another one is the fact that because we're talking about students, I'm looking at games that are set partially or completely within an educational space. So that space is quite a unique one if we sort of stop and think about it for a minute. It offers this sort of hinterland between those allowed spaces and disallowed spaces. You can be in a school at certain times, then you're not allowed to be in the school at certain times. Some people are allowed to be there, others are not. And these kind of narratives and uses of the space get played out in these games. And in general, games tend to centre not so much on the location per se, but on the narrative and graphics if people are talking about representation. But if we start looking at the actual place, it starts to bring up some really interesting kind of considerations about the age group, how they're used, how the location's used, how we associate with that location as well. And then just the last bit is sort of the darker side of those games when we have children involved in them, and that's that kind of transgressive use of child death within game, and the ways that the game will respond or reason for that use and those elements within the game. So the piece looks at dark play and taboo actions within games, which is something we all kind of enjoy, but when we start looking at that concept of child death, gets a little bit more complicated.
Fab, thank you. So thinking about the future development of TV, film and other screen media, what do you think are the key issues that should be explored in representing the complexities of student life?
So games, one of those really cool places where there's a lot of opportunity to sort of explore and test in those circumstances where, you know, you're not impacting on the everyday, but you can see impacts take place within the game. And obviously people get very, very involved in RPG games and games where you are feeling that you have an impact, that narratively, you know, your decisions have meaning. So that idea of being able to explore things like sexuality, relationships, your self-presentation that games offer are kind of a really important place for those massive complexities of being a student, being that age, being unsure of yourself, but finding a space to kind of explore safely. And I think that's one of the places where games are really kind of pushing the boundaries and really like listening to what audiences desire and want from them. But something that I'd love to see sort of change are the ways in which characters are developed and the complexities of the characters that are presented. So seems in recent years, and this is just my point of view, I hasten to add, that there's been this skew towards the presentation of a character where we have this expectation that we will accept a very thinly drawn version of a protagonist because we've decided to watch the film or TV show, or we've decided to play the game. So I'm going to steal a concept from Seinfeld, which is, why should we care about the character? And the answer currently sometimes seems to be because they're on a screen. And I don't really think that's enough. So the idea of the facets of being a student, of being that age, of being unsure, are elements that I think are really important, that they're explored and extended. And just ensuring that aspects of the character can be present rather than a key plot point seems very important as well. So in the case of games, steps have been made to offer pronoun choice, pronoun selection, romance options within games. And those options aren't commented on in the game, nor are they a key plot point in terms of if you identify how you want to be gendered or pronouned, or what romances you want to explore. But they are just something that your character can be. And I think that those are sort of the future developments that I'd love to see, where you can just really represent yourself and comment isn't necessarily made or needed. And I think that's kind of the future for game, at least.
Great. Thank you very much.
Cool.
Next, we'll hear from Devaleena Kundu, an assistant professor at UPenn University in India, about her piece, 100% Selection Guaranteed, Kota Factory and its portrayal of shadow education.
What is the key argument in your piece?
Well, my piece, which is titled 100% Selection Guaranteed, Kota Factory and its Portrayal of Shadow Education, attempts to do a close reading of this particular series and explore how the idea of social competitiveness gets exploited through the shadow education, a model of education. And often students are very viciously sort of trapped in this sort of an academic environment where they experience a lot of stress and with very little to actually achieve at the end of it. So yeah, that would be the key argument in the paper.
And thinking about the future development of TV, film, and screen media, what are the key issues that you think should be explored to represent the complexities of student life?
I'm not sure. I think from the Indian context, at least, I don't think there are that many TV shows that are exploring the experiences of student life. Coda Factory perhaps is one of those series which came out in the last couple of years, and it has attempted to look at a particular side of education. But I'm pretty sure there is a huge gap when it comes to representation itself. So it would be nice to have perhaps more TV shows and good cinema. There are, I think, a lot of the cinema that we have already explored the more. They're probably more rom-com. They're probably looking at love stories and romantic engagements, etc., but probably not necessarily the core experiences of student life, the challenges that they face, etc. Another Other than Kota Factory, another movie that I can think of is Three Idiots, which had come back some time back, and that again sort of touched upon the idea of this weird sense of competitiveness that is there, and how sometimes students are pushed to even committing suicides, etc. But other than that, I think there is very little representation thus far. So it would be nice to have more representation of students, yeah, on screen.
And finally, we'll hear from Dr. Ollie Belas from the University of Bedfordshire about his piece, The Emergence of the Student in Colin in Black and White and Top Boy.
What is the key argument in your piece?
I'll try to give you a really, really short version of this because I'm don't know about you. I always find it very hard to talk about my own work, and someone says, "Give me the sort of give me the argument. What's your thesis?" And 10 minutes later, I'm still sort of scrabbling around for it. So I'll try and do the opposite, despite that long-winded way into it. The piece, I'm trying in the piece to do something that's quite exploratory. The special issue, as you've probably said in your introduction, is to do with representation of students on screen. And so the two shows that I consider are Colin in Black and White and Top Boy. And quite deliberately, I've already broken my being brief rule, haven't I? This is not brief. Quite deliberately, rather than trying to go in with a sort of with as it were like a strong thesis, the idea was to really try to navigate, as a viewer, those two shows, recognizing that in very, very different ways and with very different narratological strategies, both shows are concerned with the intersections of class and race. But in a sense, you've asked me my thesis or what the overriding argument is. In a sense, what I'm trying to do, rather than state an argument or impose an argument, is just ask, how do they navigate the intersections of class and race, and in particular, how is that navigation done through the kind of through the grammar of film and through the grammar of film.
Thinking about the future development of TV and film, what are the key issues that you think should be explored to represent the complexities of student lives?
Struggle with this question. Partly, I'm as a teacher, as an academic, I'm reluctant. I'm a bit squeamish to say these are the issues to do with student lives that need to be represented, right? So I'm slightly going to dodge. I'm going to dodge that question with a partial answer, but feel free to press me on this, or to say if you think this is a nonsense answer. When I first saw that question, I thought I don't know how to answer it, but then I was thinking, fresh meat. Fresh meat is it's probably longer ago. It was probably made longer ago than I think, but it's not that old, and it to me already seems dated because the way those students are living are not the way that I think many, if not most, of our students are living. So the circumstances in which and under which students are going to university have changed radically, in really quite a short space of time. So my partial answer, my dodge, is whatever the issues are, I don't think they're the issues that you get from something even as recent as fresh meat. But for what issues should be developed, should be explored, and I know this is a bit of a cop-out and it sounds like sort of grandstanding and virtue signalling, but for what particular issues should be explored, go ask the students.
I think that's a really good answer. I understand why you think it's partial. I mean, I guess it's the formulation of the question was like having sort of spent time with representations of students on screen, are there things that have come out where you think actually, based on your experiences, even recently, that not like what should be done because you are an academic with an authority, but are there any gaps, or are there any kind of what you might, maybe something that's unfair, or where you think actually this is not as nuanced a representation as it could be? Now that might still be a non-answer that you want to give, and I respect that. But it's less about like being an authority and more just where are the spaces where students on screen have been not represented as of yet in ways that kind of more, as you so eloquently put there, more accurately reflect student experience and student life as it's lived now.
I mean, this is going to be very disappointing now because it's going to sound like I'm doubling down on my first non-answer. But I suppose if I think about the conversations that I've had in recent years with my students and the sorts of issues that keep coming up, they are. It really isn't the kind of the fresh meat drama. It is how do I balance my studies with the demands on time and other resources, including, of course, financial resources? How do I balance the demands of studying with care responsibilities, the implications of travel? This is the environment that I'm working in anyway is students who are very often entirely committed to being students. Right? We're talking about student representation here, screen representation of students. They're really committed to being students, but it is hard to be a student. And actually, the stakes are so much higher than they were, again, even 10 years ago. So I know I haven't listed or stipulated particular issues there, but I think the kind of the socioeconomics of going to university. I know I'm focusing on university. There are other ways of being a student. There are other phases of and we're not necessarily talking only about being a student, meaning you're in some kind of formal education. And in fact, a big part of the Top Boys section of my piece is about how a teacher-student relationship emerges far beyond the kind of discursive and ideological reach, of the school. But having said all that, the kind of the socioeconomic backdrop to being a student, particularly to being a student in HE at the moment, is so different. And I think it would have to find a way of documenting that radically changed context and how, I suppose, how it has changed radically in really such a short space of time. A generation, less than a generation.
I think that's a great answer. Yeah, I don't really want to list, but I think the way you've articulated some of those changes and those sort of challenges, I think was really well put. So thank you very much. Thanks for your piece, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks ever so much. Cheers, Neil.
So thanks to everyone for their contributions to that portion of this episode. Hopefully that gives you a kind of flavour of both the individual pieces that are featured in the issue, but also a sense of kind of where the project is coming from and where it might go in the future in terms of its currently funded projects, and also areas where sort of representations of students might be encountered in different ways. But let's get into the final part of this episode, which is where Dario interrogates me about an account piece I've written, and oh no, I'm only just where we kind of talk about the piece that I wrote in the specific context of students in film education, and then sort of we're going to look at a film that I didn't cover in the piece, but I think is a kind of interesting example of these representations. So, Dario, the floor is yours in terms of like
Wow.
what's the what were the things that emerged from reading the piece as it was as it ended up, that you wanted to sort of highlight at the moment?
Yeah, it's always interesting to kind of read the style and structure of somebody else's work, and then think to yourself, oh, would I have done that? Or what's the difference between the way that my mind works in piecing together things? Because obviously you've got your pre 2010 list of films that you kind of summarize, highlight, or point to some of the kinds of representations of film students, and then post 2010, because the piece is obviously structured around that idea that post 2010 there is kind of a sea change. And that's one thing that popped out. I mean, I wondered why that moment, if it is valid, and let's assume that it is, what's the reason why that moment, if we look back historically, is it because the students that are arriving then are changing? Or I mean, it's weird because then it's not the students who are making these films, so it's not that filmmakers will be encountering students who have changed things. So it's an odd one to I mean, maybe it's just to do with the politics of representation has changed to the extent where the idea that you just use a cheap stereotype for a laugh is kind of now passé, right? But also, it leads to the question of, are the films in the second half, are they doing it to the extent that you're saying that they, or how much are they really kind of opening up the possibilities of a more nuanced form of representation of students? And obviously that like the Sylvania is an interesting one to really focus on, because I think it's very different to the other ones that you're looking at, which are much more mainstream. And yeah, the other sort of two things I pulled out of it as an overarching structure to my thinking was the underlying sense that that the idea of studying film per se is a frivolous activity, right? And even the practice side of that, but definitely the theoretical side, because it's easier to make a case for a vocational training as the raison d'etre. The idea that you get a film student who says to their parents, "Oh, I want to go to film school because I want to be the next Tarantino," is very different to saying, "Oh, I want to be a camera operator for the BBC." Do you know what I mean? Those two things are very different ideologically, really. And then sort of on top of that, the B aspect of that is film education, particularly in the UK, is very much has the problem of a kind of ideological annexing of the arts into a cadre of essentially rich students, which in industry enables them to work for free. And also a lot of them have connections. So it reaffirms this idea of it's not what you know, it's who you know. And then on the back of that, it produces a very narrow ideological experience on the back end. So it's interesting that as a framing mechanism, or in terms of contemporary sort of politics and industry, is writ large in terms of the framework of your piece. But I'm not sure how much, apart from maybe elements of the Sylvania, but even that I think is sort of apart from that, whether the representations that are in the piece kind of sit into that context in a way that's really easy to map out. I don't think it's almost kind of not possible. I think that the representations are much more in line with kind of broader stereotypes of what people think film students must be like. And I think that the stuff in your there's stuff in your piece that's about the history of the way that the industry sees academia, and then vice versa, and the idea of who teaches film students, where do they come from, and one part of that is the academic side, and they get tarred with that brush of, well, what do you know? You've never made a film. And then the other side of that is practitioners who have made films but haven't made it as filmmakers, so they're essentially failed practitioners in that sense. That dichotomy, I think, is much clearer an influence on the representations that you're talking about. And we can go through some of those in specifically, but if you want to sort of respond to that to start with.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's writing from a place of acknowledging that this is not a huge data set, because I think you're trying to look at the representations of a group of students and trying to look at the specifics of that group, which would be in this case film students, who are students, but also the purpose of the piece is to look at them in that very, very specific context. And it's not a huge body of work. They don't really pop up very often, and the reasons for that are sort of suggested in that kind of part that looks at historical tensions and the historical relationship. But it is very much a case of trying to suggest, being very kind of cagey, I guess, in terms of like what might be at play here in terms of, and a lot of it is felt, not just from watching the films from a position of interest as films, but from the context of us as, and myself who working in sort of higher education. And having done that work and looking at, well, is there a relationship between the way that industry views academia and vice versa, that could be kind of certainly subtextual and under the surface, not an unconscious way that of kind of, well, this is what a film student is because of X, Y, and Z. So, but again, and even within that, that whole grouping of like, I think it's like 19. The earliest film is like the early 70s up until sort of 2010, and then a break. It's not a scientific, dividing line. It's very much looking at all of those films and thinking, actually, these are the representation here is quite narrow. The representation after that is less narrow, as in like it's not all of a sudden, but there are, so Dear White People, Dolomite, and The Souvenir, very, very different films with very, very different agendas, but within those represent, what those students do as students, how they talk about film, how they make film is kind of, it feels very different to the types of representations you would see before, which were much less.
Yeah.
And in line with a lot of the papers in the Students on Screen piece and the Students on Screen project in general, just more interested in that being a kind of a more complex and nuanced experience in terms of their lived situation, how that lived situation feeds in, which it does in The Souvenir, and in the kind of polar opposite way to what it does in Dear White People. But understanding, okay, there are other things at play in these students' lives that are feeding into their decision to study film and the kind of film education that they want. So it is more, and I always saw this as the reason for writing the piece was to have a conversation about it and to sort of just to kind of, and partly to sort of bring a lot of those films to light, because they're not necessarily much seen, a lot of them, and even within sort of filmmakers' work like Gregor Arki, like not necessarily the film that people would go to, and saying, well, what if we kind of look at it from this context? And that's, but also trying to not just be very vague and descriptive and saying, hey, look, but actually kind of start a conversation about, why are these kind of egotistical nerds the go-to historically, in terms of the representations, particularly of male film students, of which they are, as everywhere, the dominant demographic. And a lot of that does have to do, I think, with how that generation of 70s filmmakers were perceived, even if it wasn't necessarily true. And I always laugh that people think that Spielberg is a film school graduate, even though he was denied. He was, rejected from USC and didn't study. But he's kind of bundled in with this film nerd studying film kind of thing, which is
Mm.
that in itself as an idea that isn't necessarily something that's real. I think is an interesting thing to sort of circle around.
Yeah, and it's interesting actually that the sort of movie brat mythology doesn't really play out that much in the films pre-2010 that you're talking about. And in fact, it's much more likely that there is a representation of a traumatic experience,
Yeah.
whether that's because of a particular teacher or whether that's a sense that the film industry is, this hive of disgusting behavior, and also that sort of sense of the entry, the pathway to getting something made has to be necessarily sort of low budget exploitative types of cinema. And then also you get that sense of filmmakers who have kind of made it and have this sort of superiority of, well, I dropped out of film school, or I never bothered with film school, and I made it, or they went through, were rejected in some way, or weren't taken seriously, or whatever it might be, and it was therefore everything about university, everything about film school, is there's nothing of value there at all.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how those kinds of things play out, and also, right through this history, there are those sort of stereotypes of particular types of film student, which I mean, and again, I'm sort of narrowing this down and reifying it in a in a specific way. And if you're going to put it down to a particular kind of dichotomy, then on the one hand, you've got the sort of nerd, uber film nerd / cinephile hubris.
Yeah.
And then you've got on the other hand, the sort of student who doesn't know anything about anything at all, and is kind of doesn't. And when you see some representations, but particularly I like the Wiener Dog one, where you've got that scenario of the teacher who's just with admissions asking students questions about films, and at the end the last thing is, just give me the name of a film, please, because they won't commit. What I mean? It's like, what's your favorite film? Oh, I don't know. Oh, well, do you like certain genres, or do you like directors? Well, I kind of like everything is the answer, and it's like, just name a film, please, and you'll get in, kind of thing. It's hilarious. So yeah, what's interesting then is how that moves forward, and perhaps you get the possibility where the idea of being on a film set and being in a kind of educational situation, which might not necessarily be in class, but like in Dolomite, for example, or in certain areas of the Sylvania films, although again, there's just a sort of individualized complexity about that, because they are sort of self-referential films, they're autobiographical to a certain degree. But that sense that the film student as outsider finding their people, on the film set, and learning something about themselves, and maybe learning something about life through cinema, which is something that we kind of, laud and applaud in some way. I mean, I always think when I'm teaching about film, it's like universities hate it when this happens, but you say, look, I don't really care whether you get a job. What I'm interested in is that you're an interesting person, and you can say something interesting through film. And I think industry hates that just as much.
Oh, they do.
They don't want that, you know what I mean? So
yeah.
it becomes a sort of interesting question as to what film courses are doing and should be doing, because there's so many kind of competing tides pushing lecturers and students one way and the other. So again, maybe that is something that really doesn't filter through to the films. It's much more about a kind of like an experience that becomes something that's either idealized or something that's made kind of problematic because of grander narratives, let's say.
Yeah, for sure. Although what's interesting about Wiener Dog is the there is that representation of students which kind of fits, but also throughout the film, their ownership of their education is something that is represented in a different way, in terms of why are they doing it, what do they want out of it, what do they expect from teachers,
Yeah.
which is obviously where the rewrite is interesting as well, which we're going to talk about shortly. But that's one of the noticeable shifts, particularly in that, and I think it pops up in the souvenir, even though it's set further in the past. There is this idea of a student's agency, not just as passive, vessels or pre, which I think is very common, particularly in some of those earlier representations. Like they come in with a kind of a pre-existing identity they don't want to shift. Whereas I think that what creeps in is a very kind of contemporary, neoliberal marketized representation of education as a space where students are coming in and saying, well, actually, I want to be taught, I want a job, and not being ashamed about that. And being like, I'm here to learn, and this is what I want to learn. This is the subject that I want to learn. So you are a kind of, and that is definitely a shift where that brings up, particularly in the case of Wiener Dog, some really interesting humor, but also some interesting tensions in terms of, like you were saying before, that kind of that teacher position, and in that it's a screenwriter who's had a hit and ended up teaching, and it's trying to do everything they can to get out of the situation of teaching, which again, to having students sort of push back and say, well, you're here and you should be doing this job because this is your job, I think is an interesting, a really interesting new tension, which wasn't there before, that, and because I think what has also shifted is spending time in the classroom more. A lot of the stuff in terms of the representations of film students take place outside of the classroom. They're just on campus or around being film students, talking about films and being all nerdy and kind of quirky or, cool. Whereas there is a shift towards actually like not in huge ways, but what is it to be in a classroom studying film? What is it to actually go through the process of writing a script for assessment, developing a voice, thinking critically and contextually. And I loved a lot of the rewrite for that, constant references to kind of wider film context, even in the most mainstream kind of like rotely structured kind of thing. I thought it did have an awareness of the importance of thinking and context and reflection, and and actually seeing students do that rather than just being told to do that, I thought was.
But again, I mean, I'll definitely come to the film in a second. But I think that's one of the interesting things, that it almost kind of contradicts itself in some ways. It idealizes that when that doesn't happen, really. I mean,
no,
it might happen in individual classes that where a teacher sets out for a particular thing. But like any form of education, if the students don't play ball, it just doesn't happen,
no, I think that's a really valid point as well in terms of that romanticization of it. But then it's almost like with any representation, it takes years for the reality of the now to catch up with representation. But that's a really good point.
And I think that one of the things through all these films, and again, really pertaining to the question of what are universities doing, or what should they be doing in terms of film education? I know you wrote your PhD on this, and you've got very clear ideas. But again, I think it's ever changing, isn't it? Because I mean, even for the film, for students who come into universities, they want to make films. They want to be part of the industry, right? What does the industry make films for? But I know at the very base level, it's like, they want to make money. But before that, it's like, the reasoning's to get it made, because the hardest part about getting a film made is getting it made. You know what I mean? It's just literally, oh my God, you made a feature film. That's amazing. That's so hard to do, whether it's funding, all of the complexities. So you got to get it made. And then I think that there's a sort of underlying assumption, again, maybe in an idealized mythology, that fame and money will then follow, right? So there's that sort of discourse when it comes to why a film's being made. But then at university, and again, maybe we need to be clear about, there's film school and then there's film university, which I think in a UK context are very different. To me, there should be more of an engagement of why. What's the deliberative sense of cinematic value here? and I've said this before to students, like, if you're going to make a zombie movie, fine, make a zombie movie, but let's have a point to it, or let's make it the best zombie movie it can be, and have a chance of succeeding in the conditions of the industry. But I think sometimes those two questions from the two different angles that I'm talking about are not either not talked about, not set up by academics and not set up by teachers, sorry, and then not even really engaged with students. It's just kind of like a given. I want to make a film, and my film's going to be good, and therefore it's going to be seen. Do you know what I mean? Because these things are just so not, don't follow each other anymore.
Yeah, it's that's true, isn't it? Yeah, and it's funny because when you sort of said, like, zombie movie, my mind goes to like Jacques Tourneur and Bertrand Bonello, 28 Days Later, and the job for us has always been the excitement about being able to bring that stuff into a conversation. But that is ultimately not really certainly not what industry has wanted from education, historically and contemporarily, and not really what the majority of students want. And I think it's right. Like, they don't even want to question why films are made. They just want to be involved in the making of films because it's seen as this, which is interesting. It's, you're talking about the romanticization of sort of film education in a classroom context, and those kinds of conversations. But there is also this kind of romanticization that students come with about filmmaking as an industrial thing.
Yeah.
That is not the reality. The reality is incredibly hard, incredibly challenging, physically and sort of mentally. It's incredibly demanding to make films, whatever your role is on it, even if you have the privilege of being able to support yourself to do that without being paid, which I think is a really great point. It has a kind of physical toll to actually do this work at a non any kind of level, really, sort of feature above, independent feature, whatever. That does this thing when you're kind of teaching it, which I don't know about your experience, where students see how hard it is and are like, oh my God, this is not romantic. It can be fun in the way that all artistic practice can be fun if it's kind of, and you can get into these really good states with it. But once they realize it's really, really hard and not how they might have thought it was
and it's compromise. That's the other thing, which a lot of students can't deal with that.
No. And they can't work out the difference between compromise and collaboration, which is part of what we definitely try and teach. But there is that sense of once they realize, they stick with it because they've already made that decision, which has put them into the university, which is like, well, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I've decided I'm going to do. And it's like that energy going out it doesn't mean that things are changing. It doesn't mean that and it also means that they don't enjoy their degree as much because they can see the work and they think, oh my God, this is what my life's going to be like. And this is not it's not what I thought it was. And they can't always see, and this is not their fault. This is not a judgment on students at all, but they can't always see the possibilities of change or the possibilities of the other stuff within it. It's just because it's so fundamentally different to what they perceive in terms of what the representations of filmmaking have been historically, and then film education within that. As a very, very small subsection.
Yeah, and just before we go on to the film, because I think there's some interesting sort of connections, obviously, to what we've already talked about. I think that sense of I didn't want to get into a kind of like position where, because we've had some students kind of contact us, haven't we, and sort of be kind of, not all students are like that, and it's like we have to give that caveat all the time. And this one of the interesting things about sort of this piece and this subject area is that sometimes the things that get written about, the things that get represented, are the minority, are the odd one that seems to encapsulate a certain type of humorous or sensibility that we can kind of look at and go and sort of parody. But I think that we have to turn the lens on the tutors, on the teachers, on the practitioners, and I think that sort of bringing in of your baggage from a practitioner sense is definitely key to say something like the Sylvanea, and to the rewrite in a very different kind of way, where there is a fundamental belief in the way that things should be done or are, and that's based on the experiences often that the the tutor has had, which a lot of the time could be negative, and then that feeds into a relationship which can almost close doors rather than open them. And I think from a theory side, coming from my side, I think what's also interesting is that having to turn the lens on yourself and say, look, is what you're teaching here going to be useful? How can it be applied to a greater number of students so that it has a viability, it has an interest, it has a possibility, it takes them somewhere, rather than, well, you should know about the you should have read Andrew Sarris's entire book, so you understand the nature of the authorial underpinning of and it's like, who gives a fuck about that? You know what I mean? Really, if in 2024 and you just want to shoot stuff and see what happens, so there's a kind of balance there as well, because I think if you go too far the other way, you end up just shooting stuff that has been done a million times before. If you have no awareness of the past and no awareness of cinema as a cultural history and as a process. So it's just one last thing before we go. I thought it was really interesting in the piece where you were talking about that idea of, particularly in the 60s and 70s, where universities set themselves up as a kind of furnace of anti-Hollywood, anti-establishment creative sensibility. And I think one question I would have is that really possible, say, in the UK HE system in 2024? I just don't think that has been, the edges or the possibilities of experimentation have been kind of weeded out beyond just sort of, going through the sort of motions. Oh, look at this stuff, look at that stuff, because there's so many, the architecture of the rules are so imposed about what can and can't be done. It's very hard now, I think, to have that sensibility. And part of it is what you've talked about in terms of students being hammered with employment. What's the employability of this course, kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't think you can, and I think what's interesting about that history is that there's only really one example in kind of Western film culture where that has ever been resisted, which was in Denmark, and I don't know if I mentioned that in the piece in the end, I can't remember, because again, not talking about anglophone sort of case studies, but yeah, like if UCLA can't make it work and foster the LA Rebellion filmmakers and then can't maintain that position, it's hard to see, and sort of in the doctorate, interview people like Alex Ross Perry and their experience of being at NYU and just being like, this is an industry. They just see it as an industry school, and like his education at film school, which is something that's coming up this year in this documentary he's put out, this video essay he's put out about video shops, is like it's not that kind of cultural, contextual, wider, poetic, whatever it is not necessarily in that education. And it doesn't serve the industry in the long term. It doesn't serve culture. It doesn't serve the students. It's a short-termist kind of reactionary response to what the dominant market, which in this case is the creative industries, is demanding. And all of those kind of skills gap reports from the last few years are all about, let's keep industry happy and keep industry going. And it's like, none of it's about, are these exploitative practices that exist still in the predominantly in industry, still exploitative practices, as the norm in film and television? Should we still just be farming out our graduates to work under that? I find that. That's another podcast, but I do find it kind of morally questionable, which is why, like you were saying, like standing in the way of those metrics and saying it shouldn't be about getting a job, because the job is going to suck. It's going to destroy you. You're going to burn out if you can even afford to do it for 6 months. And then you're going to be discarded and someone else is going to take your place on that conveyor belt. To get to those positions of aspiration in the film industry, it just includes so much personal sacrifice. And it might not be worth it, because like you say, what do you get to do at the top anyway?
And it's interesting to read be part of the different worlds really where this kind of thing is being discussed. Because now I read and follow a lot of people on Substack, which is obviously this independent, an independently minded writing platform, but now video is on there a lot, and there's an awful lot of people on there from the film industry who are talking about a new independent culture. And it's like they're saying, screw the film industry. You can't, you're just not going to get a career in what traditionally was known as the film industry. And also, and we're part of this as the podcast. I mean, why did we set this up really? It's like, because we felt that part of it was to do with the fact that we felt we didn't have the spaces in the university to talk about film in the way that we wanted to talk about. And that, in some senses, that wasn't the university's fault, but it was like nobody came on board. Do you know what I mean? It was like you do research seminars and stuff like that, and no students turn up, and maybe one or two members of staff turn up, and like everybody's burnt out, and I can't blame everybody for that. But also, it seems like there needs to be a different format of setting things up to attract people's interest, I think. And stuff is in massive flux, I think, in all of these areas.
Yeah, and I don't want to lay it on staff in terms of showing up, but I think a part of it is modeling that and finding those pockets of time to actually kind of participate in the education system that you want. And that is really, I mean, it's still demoralizing to do stuff and no staff turn up, and I do feel like sometimes that modeling for students of what we believe this is, get a few students who turn up and there's no staff there, for these kinds of events that are for all. They'll be like, well, if the staff aren't here, why would I be? And I get that, and I know that staff are overworked and burnt out and stuff, but it's also like we need to do this together in those spaces where it's still possible, or those very, very few tiny spaces will just completely disappear, and then it will have these kind of mythical representations. The reality won't even exist in a tiny way, and it's not like it's ever been the dominant space. But
for sure. So on Rewrite then, why did you want to focus on this one in terms of a chat between me and you, but not particularly focus on it in the piece? Was there something in here that you thought, this is doing something kind of interesting in a different way?
Yeah, because it's kind of like it's the most mainstream. I know that Dolomite was Netflix.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of sensibility in Dolomite. It's about independent film.
Yeah.
In a way that the Rewrite is not. Wiener Dog is kind of art house indie. Souvenir is art house indie. Dear White People is art house indie. They kind of exist in this slightly more kind of contextual space, even though Dolomite is a big movie, it has this other stuff. Whereas the Rewrite felt like this is essentially a kind of mainstream rom-com with Hugh Grant, but the context is that he is a screenwriter who goes to teach at this college, and I'm just interested in terms of like, well, what kind of representation pops up in that space where I was interested in what would be the representation of what film is in this context. And the writer director Mark Lawrence went to the college, university, Binghamton College, that's sort of represented, but he didn't study film, so it wasn't like a personal thing. Had a college education but not film. So I was curious as to what does that representation look like of film students, screenwriting, but certainly kind of film screenwriting students, in a very, very mainstream, very, very fluffy. Was a Hugh Grant movie, so like, what does it look like in that space was why I thought I'd sort of keep it out and for us to chat about it. And are there any links? Are there any similarities?
I mean, like from the start, this is 2014, right? So I'm just trying to think where this sits in relationship to, again, without sort of being overtly kind of critical of this term because I know it's just everywhere, but like, where does this sit in relationship to when kind of the idea of woke was either the thing that you actually had to be on the right side of history, society, culture, or this thing that is kind of destroying freedom of speech and freedom of thought, or you know, a kind of just a talking point for the right wing politics? Because, you know, Hugh Grant sort of turns up to this college and essentially has sex with the first young person he encounters, which happens to be one of his students, right? So it's kind of like, I was just thinking, like, there will be people who will watch this movie who will be like, this is absolutely disgusting and I'm turning this off because it's actually morbidly offensive from the word go. And it's interesting that you call it, because it, like, for me, I agree. Like, I can watch this with a sort of light and fluffy air on it, but I think from a different standpoint, you know, you could look at this and go, oh my God, this guy is the most raving misogynist that, you know, you could see in this kind of essentially rom-com-y style. I mean, it's not a rom-com. He does sort of have this burgeoning connection with Marissa Tomei's character, who is an older student in his class. But yeah, so that from a starting point is a really interesting tonal element that I just sort of was grappling with in terms of, oh wow, I wonder how this is going to be read by somebody who's in their 20s and like really sort of politically switched on in that kind of sense. But I really liked the, you know, he's a kind of one-hit wonder screenwriter. He's had a massive success and he's sort of been riding on that. And then he goes to this college and basically at the beginning does anything he can to get out of any teaching, because he's got his underlying philosophy is you cannot teach screenwriting or you cannot teach writing, right? And that's an interesting starting point, because it leads to the question of, can art be taught at all? Can you, I mean, what are we doing in these classrooms? Is it all a big ruse? You know, and I know that there are people who sort of think about that idea in terms of art, which is you just go out and you experiment until you figure it out, and that's basically education in that sense, right? And the other thing is that it reminded me of, because he kind of accidentally becomes a great teacher in that sense, because he knows how to break down structure and he knows how to break down dialogue and he knows how to assess ideas in that sense. And when he sort of accidentally gives them like critiques and feedback, and also has an awareness of the industry, because he can say, you know, well, this won't work and that will work. You know what I mean? So there's a sort of interesting sense in the way that his pedagogic practice sort of evolves over time. And just related to what I said at the beginning in terms of the sort of dated sexual politics, though, it's interesting because he both is, through the film, a nice guy who looks after all of his students, yet ends up, you know, doing all these morally bankrupt things at the same time. Kind of almost sort of, oh wow, I didn't realize that was not allowed, kind of thing. Yeah. But yeah, even the film itself kind of falls into that trap when. So Alison Janney plays a very stereotypical kind of Jane Austen scholar who has no life apart from Jane Austen and just reads the world entirely through her relationship with Jane Austen and sees him as this, you know, completely frivolous, exactly the kind of attitude that a proper, you know, old school academic would have to somebody who comes from Hollywood and is going to teach screenwriting. Like, this isn't a proper subject, kind of thing, right? This is not proper writing. But and again, she just, by the end, lets him off. She's going to prosecute him and get him fired, right? But then lets him off at the very end, because it ties in nicely with the script of the story. I mean, that's one of the things I had to laugh at the very end. I wrote down irony. Everything is tied up perfectly in this film. You know what I mean? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, God, I've gone on a lot there. So I don't know if there's anything you want to come in on.
Yeah, no, I think it's yeah, loads there. Yeah, it is. It's a pre-Me Too movie, but also it's interesting because it uses his attitude to women, particularly, you know, because all of the all of the kind of the conflicts and sort of narrative shifts are all around the three women. So Janny as the kind of the professor who's in charge of the ethics committee, lest we forget. And the female student, and then Marissa Tomei's mature student. Interesting representation of a mature student, which I touched on a little bit in the conversation with Beth and Kay. But like it uses those relationships as a way of kind of showing, getting into the themes of the story, which is interestingly, like just hearing you talk about it. And one of the reasons, again, like I thought, why is this slightly different? Is because it's very critical of industry in that, he has almost been completely conditioned to live that way as if it's just absolutely normal, which is interesting pre sort of Me Too exposure. Like a lot of that stuff is kind of unsaid. And then it's being in the academy that helps him understand that's not necessarily how you should. To actually it's a kind of a pointed statement of saying, well, the film industry is just really morally bankrupt. And everyone looks down on him, and like everyone thinks he's really cool because he wrote this very famous movie, but some people look down on him because he works in movies, including Janny's character. There is this tension. But it's also, it's used as a way of saying, actually, like the university is a way that we can think. We are expected to be critical of this stuff, even if it's just at the level of what you do in your personal life, and why that might be, why you want to just put the brakes on, like literally the first dinner that he has out, isn't it? And it's like you can see, you just thought, we know where this is going, even if you haven't read the plot. But even in that female character, the female student, there's some really interesting stuff around the things that she says about sexuality and being a student. About
that's Bella Heathcote, isn't it?
Yeah, and her generation. It's not like blow the doors off progressive, but it's kind of thoughtful in ways that was unexpected in terms of its representation of some of those students. And it does have a little fun, but it's not cruel to those students. And his relationship with them is really nice. I love the bit where he says, I bet none of you could name 3 Bergman films. And then these 2 students, one, they just start riffing them off. And he's like, well, like, apart from you 2, which kind of like acknowledges the nerds. And there's that bit at the start where he was sort of saying about these kinds of like he becomes this inspirational, wonderful teacher. And the film knows what it's doing, because at the very start, isn't it, when she says, you need to take this seriously, he says, well, I'll go home and watch Dead Poets Society tonight. Like that. And that obviously is it's more self-aware than
it is, and it even goes beyond the film education stuff, because there's like there's the STEM versus humanities thing where one of the teachers, he said, my wife left me for a physics laureate somewhere, you know what I mean? It's like, she found the sort of higher level of academic rather than the English professor, at college.
Chris Elliott, as he says, well, Bob is something like the Higgs boson, something about
Higgs boson, which is hilarious. And I think that there's that element as well of J.K. Simmons is in it as well, so it's got a really good cast.
It's fun.
And he's good with the whole with the family thing, that underneath this sort of exterior he's got this absolute undying love for his situation of his family and what have you. I mean that's the most I suppose the Bella Heathcote thing is the most complex thing and the most troubling thing as well, because she's got a certain level of agency, and it's written into the script where she says, you don't think I can make a decision for myself who I want to sleep with? I slept with you didn't sleep with me, kind of thing going on. But on the other side of that, it's obviously the sort of teacher student, there's a power dynamic there, whether or not she thinks she's got that agency, that's in some, obviously that sort of supersedes, because the teacher has the power over passing her essentially, and for other reasons as well. But then there's I think what's interesting in terms of the representations of the students, it does play around with those stereotypes, and I think that like you say, it does it in a playful way. And you've got the Star Wars geek, which we've seen a million times. It's just like everything he writes is basically a version of Star Wars, right? But then, he teaches him and says, why don't you do it a character who is obsessed with Star Wars, but then comes to the realization, that his own identity needs to be kind of engaged with a bit more, so interesting stuff. And then, like I say, that the peer review element of it, I think, is really interesting in relationship to our experiences as well, because peer review is one of the hardest things I think that students have to deal with, and a lot of them just completely, they put a barrier up, when it comes to that. Whereas in this film, it has that can't happen. There has to be a lively engagement with each other's work.
Yeah.
And like students literally telling another student, your work is shit, or your work is good, or have you thought about this, that, and the other? All, you know what I mean? Because that's part of the sort of dynamic of development of ideas.
Yeah.
Which again, I think is sort of very difficult to get to that in reality when you're dealing with students, because there's so much uncertainty and insecurity. And I think, going back to something we were talking about earlier, that idea of student, why are film students here? What do they want to do? And I think sometimes a lot film students, they just want to make a film that they can watch and show to their parents, and that's the extent of it.
Yeah.
They don't want to engage with an audience. They don't want to have their film critiques. They just want to say, I made my little film about my life and I'm happy with that,
Yeah. And that's kind of acknowledged in the film, I think, in terms of like, it doesn't make them all out to be these kinds of really aspirational, career minded, or, they've got their reasons for doing it. And that includes just wanting to get better at the thing that's in front of them, I think it's a really nice. The other thing as well, I think they use the Marissa Tomei character as a kind of romantic device. He learns to become interested in a woman of his own age, like many Hollywood films, or closer to his own age, we should say. But they also use that as a way of talking about teaching. Like he can have a conversation with that character about how his perceptions of teaching changes, but also what she expects from, kind of vocalizes these questions around teaching and that student in ways that are kind of built into the narrative, but feel less, kind of forced and pointed than if it's with an 18 or 19-year-old, and having, like, it just felt more natural in terms of why she's studying and what she wants. I thought that was kind of nicely done. I didn't feel as I thought there was lots of stuff like that, and it was nice to see a mature student in there as well, and that relationship in the classroom was handled interestingly. So a surprising film in terms of both, one of those things, like with all this stuff, I knew watching it was going to have a lot to say in terms of representations, because the focus is on that. So I knew there'd be stuff to talk about, but it was enjoyable, which was always nice. It's always nice when you watch something, you're like, oh, this is actually a well, and it's interesting in terms of like what the why of education. Well, it was a well-made movie that served its purpose, and had references to Elaine May. So
indeed, absolutely. And there are those little Easter eggs in there as well throughout, because there's some interesting ones related to Jane Austen as well, and I think it's an interesting watch in this context, without a doubt.
Yeah, for sure. So hopefully people will check that out alongside all of the texts that are covered in the Students on Screen special issue. And thanks again to the contributors who gave their time to talk about their work, and thanks to Beth and Kay for putting it all together and for inviting us to do this episode to coincide with the issue. It's been a really engaging experience. And as this conversation has proved, that this is the stuff that we come back to again and again on this podcast from our own sort of positions as people who have worked in and sort of continue to work in academia and work with students. It's a rich area, and always grateful for the opportunity to cover it. So thank you, Dario, for your contributions there.
No problem. Anytime. Enjoyed that.
We will be back, and we'll be no doubt be talking about this stuff again at some point, because it's not resolved. Who knew? But for now, this has been the Cinematologist podcast. Thanks for listening.